with you.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Immediately after the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus insisted that his disciples get back into the boat and precede him to the other side of the sea, while he dismissed the multitudes of the people. After sending them home, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. Night fell, and he was alone. Meanwhile, the disciples were in trouble far from shore, for a strong wind had risen, and their boat was being tossed by heavy waves. About 3 o'clock in the morning, Jesus came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him, they, in their fear, cried out, "It is a ghost!" But Jesus spoke to them at once. "Do not be afraid," he said. "Take courage, I am here." Then Peter called to him, "Lord, if it is really you, tell me to come to you, walking on the water." "Yes, come," Jesus said. So Peter went over the side of the boat and walked on the water towards Jesus. But when he saw how strong the wind and the waves were, he was frightened and began to sink. "Save me, Lord," he shouted. Jesus immediately reached out with his hand and caught Peter, saying, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt me?" When they climbed back into the boat, the wind stopped. Then the disciples worshipped him, exclaiming, "Truly, you are the Son of God." My sisters and my brothers, this is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
One of the things you might have noticed when you came in this morning is that the seating arrangement has changed. I know that was bewildering to many of you because you have your reserved seat week after week and you know where to find it. And I saw people wandering around the sanctuary kind of in a state of confusion. We did not do this new arrangement to confuse you, nor is it permanent, but we had an event yesterday, a wedding, and the bride wanted to walk down a clearly defined aisle. And we didn't have time to change the chairs in the way we normally have it. You know, the seating arrangement within a church says something about the theology of that church. Yes. And normally here at St. Matthew's, we have a semicircle as we are gathered as a people, as a community, around the table of Jesus. That says something about our theological commitment. It emphasizes that the liturgy is not something that is done for the people, but that the liturgy itself is something done by the people as we gather in community. We each have our role and our part, and each role is co-equal with the other role. And so the seating arrangement that we normally have emphasizes that, and that is a value of Vatican II. That's what came out of Vatican II, a new way of looking at the church. The traditional way, or what we call the traditional way, in which everyone is lined up in rows, very neat rows, going all the way back to the back of the church, well, that also has a theology. And it suggests to me that that expresses a theology where everyone has to conform. The laity are to conform and be passively observing what is going on for them. And that is an old way of thinking, where the church is the clergy and the people are coming to get whatever crumbs the clergy can then impart to them for another week. So I don't want you to dislike how you're seating now, but I just want you to know it's not normal for us. And so we'll be back to normal next week, and you'll much more easily find the seat that you're accustomed to sitting in on Sunday. This morning, we have visiting with us a delegation, you might say, from Belgium. Because as you know, through the missionary activity of St. Matthew's, the movement that we call the ECC, the Ecumenical Catholic Communion, has spread internationally. And one of the first countries that we had come to was in Belgium. And so I'm really pleased today that our good friend, Deacon Yeti, is back with us. We missed her while she was away, and I know that Martha really missed her and is glad to have her back. And then, not only has she come back from the House of Ruth in Belgium, but she also brought her grandson, Niles. Nils, I'm sorry. I anglicized it. Nils. And then one of the sisters from the House of Ruth, Diane, is here. And would you stand up and greet everyone in the community? This is, I think, Nils' first time in America. And is that true for you too, Diane?
Yes.
Your first time? So I hope we're making a good impression on you. That's good. That's good. Many are the storms that beset our lives. We are surrounded by many troubles. There are many things that create a sense of deep anxiety within all of us. In fact, anxiety seems to be a constant companion in our daily lives. We worry incessantly about what could go wrong. And there is good reason for this, because our experience of life is such that even though there are moments of peace, joy, and celebration, of love that we experience in life, at the same time, these conditions are often interrupted by stuff that seems to happen oftentimes unpredictably. We become the victims of random disasters. And the disasters can be on a very small scale to me individually. It is a disaster when I run into difficulties with my physical health. It is a disaster when I lose someone that I love in death. It is a disaster when I lose my job. So things happen to me in my own personal life that suggest that I experience the storminess of existence, what it is to be a human being in the world. And this is a source of great disappointment to us. Why can't things just constantly go well for me? And when something besets our lives, we inevitably lift our eyes to heaven and ask that question of God in prayer, why me? But we are not alone in this kind of situation, but this is true for all of us as individuals, but also collectively. When a natural disaster happens, such as an earthquake or a hurricane or a tornado or a tsunami, we are once again reminded that as beautiful as nature is and as beautiful as the world is, there is a dangerous side to reality. That the earth and nature is filled with great danger. And people would say, and well say, we ought to beware because we know not when we will be subject to some sort of natural disaster. And I think these contribute to the state of anxiety that we find often driving our lives and driving our behavior. Fear is like a disease. And even though we all experience anxiety at a certain level, there are moments when we experience great terror in life. And it seems like the worst thing that could possibly happen is when human beings, in the midst of all this, if it's not bad enough that we have to face all of these difficulties and challenges and disasters that come upon us, that at the same time we make it even worse because we turn against each other. I heard a song in which someone said, "We are armed and we are dangerous." And this has never been more true than in our own day, as we witness the unfolding of events now occurring in the Middle East, in a place called Iraq and Syria. This is a dreadful thing that is happening into the world. And it seems to be a condition coming from people of fervent faith. People who are religious that are performing these kinds of atrocities. And this is a very frightening thing for us indeed. In fact, in the ancient Near East, there was an ethnic group of people called the Assyrians. And the Assyrians were centered in a city-state called Nineveh, which now is in northern Syria and northern Iraq. The Assyrian people created one of the earliest empires of the ancient world. And they conquered most of the Middle East. And they were the traditional enemies of Israel. They were known for their brutality. The Assyrian people were conquered then by the Babylonians. So the oppressor became the oppressed. And the oppressed became the oppressor. And then the Babylonians succumbed to the growing empire of Persia. And then the Persian Empire was destroyed by the Greeks under Alexander the Great. And then the Greeks were then in turn conquered by the Romans. This is the continual story of humankind. One civilization rises and violently displaces another civilization. And this has been the sorry story of humankind down through the ages, even into our present day. The Assyrians, however, in the 2nd century of our own era, were evangelized by the apostles and by Christian evangelists. And as a people, they embraced the gospel of Jesus. They became one of the most ancient Christian communities in the world today. And they have persisted and have existed in that region of the world from the 2nd century all the way now to the 21st century. It is this group of people that are under threat of genocide. They are being persecuted and they are being attacked bitterly, and their lives are threatened merely because of their faith identity. We, therefore, have the responsibility for praying for our brothers and sisters of the Assyrian church. It is the last remaining church, I believe, that still celebrates their liturgy in the ancient Aramaic language, which was the language that Jesus spoke. It would be a great tragedy in our own day if this community were to be displaced, dispersed, and destroyed and would no longer exist on the face of the earth. Let us hold these people in our prayers. They are our sisters and our brothers, and like you and me, they have put their faith in Jesus Christ, and they have been a witness to Christ for many generations in the last 2,000 years. They must be in complete state of terror and fear as they are driven from their homes. Many of them have been brutally killed, as these terrorists have now revived the ancient Roman practice by death by crucifixion. People have been dying over there in recent days through this brutal act of violence called crucifixion. It's hard to believe that in our time this unimaginable catastrophe is happening among us, and it's perpetrated by human beings. In the story today of Elijah the prophet, we gain some sort of insight into the struggle in which we all as human beings are engaged. And it is a religious struggle. Religion plays a very big part in human existence. It is something that we created as human beings. We invented religion because somehow the religious impulse within the human heart is intrinsic to our humanity. I have spoken on this oftentimes in the past. But we are experiencing a religious struggle today. So was Elijah the prophet nearly 2,800 years ago in ancient Israel. Elijah the prophet was beset by great fear because he was engaged in a great and brutal religious conflict that existed in Israel of his time. There were two competitive religions vying for the loyalty of the ancient people of Israel. There were two different deities that they were being pulled between. Two different, entirely different visions of God. Now, Ahab, we are told, was the king of Israel at this time. And he was a very wicked king. And we are told that he was a wicked king because he listened to his wife. Don't take any lessons from that, my brothers. You should listen to your wife. But in this particular case with King Ahab, he had a wife that was more wicked than he was. Her name was Jezebel. And so Jezebel becomes a name that symbolizes the ultimate femme fatale, the evil woman, the black magic woman who leads her man astray, and along with him the entire nation. She was promoting a particular religion. It was the religion of Baal, or Baal, a false god. You might have heard of this deity. And the religion of Baal was a religion that worshipped the forces of nature itself. It was believed that Baal was the god of the sky, the god of the storm, the god who was in charge of whatever happens in the natural world. And they were afraid of Baal. And they would offer sacrifices to Baal to ensure that no natural catastrophe or action in the realm of nature, what we call the acts of God, earthquakes, floods, and famines and fires, these things were equated with the god Baal. And it was believed by the ancients living in this part of the world at this time that if you did not placate Baal, he will send some kind of disaster upon you. And so they would resort to making very great sacrifices, and they even performed and practiced human sacrifice. They would offer their firstborn as sacrifice unto Baal to ensure Baal's favor. Does this image of God sound familiar to you? An angry God that is going to strike out against you if you do not somehow flatter him with praises and worship and acknowledgement and ultimately of sacrifice. But contrasted with this religion was the religion of Yahweh. Yahweh was the God of Moses, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He was also the God of Elijah. And now in this conflict between Elijah the prophet and Jezebel, Jezebel had threatened the prophet and was out to kill him. And she sent out her forces to do just that. And this is why in the story this morning we see Elijah running for fear of his life. Elijah was afraid. Elijah began to feel that the religion of Baal somehow was overpowering his religion of Yahweh. And so he ran. We are told that he ran all the way from Israel down into the Arabian desert to Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai. He went there because it was on Mount Sinai that Yahweh revealed himself as the powerful creator God, the liberating God, to Moses many generations before Elijah. So Elijah was not only running to Horeb, but he was running back to the very foundations of his faith. And he ran in fear. And just like most of the embellishments of Hebrew narrative, somehow the prophet Elijah was endowed with super speed, like the Flash. And so he ran all the way without stopping, all the way to Mount Horeb. And there he entered into a cave. And while he was there, he heard a voice speak to him. A still, small voice. And the voice was that of Yahweh, his God. And Yahweh said to Elijah, "What are you doing here?" And then as Elijah was in the cave, a great wind with hurricane force winds came and shook the mountain, and the rocks were even falling and splitting in half. Such was the terrifying experience of this great wind. And then we're told by the storyteller, and Yahweh was not in the wind. And a little later, there was an earthquake that shook the mountain to its very foundations. And Elijah was terrified because there were landslides occurring all around him. And he was afraid. And then the storyteller goes on to say, and Yahweh was not in the earthquake. And then a great fire, a firestorm broke forth and burned all the dry grass and plants on that mountain. And it terrified Elijah. And then the writer says, however, Yahweh was not in the fire. And then, as Elijah was in his cave, praying desperately, he heard the sound of a still, small voice within the depths of his heart. God was in the still, small voice in the inner sanctuary, the secret chamber within the heart of the prophet Elijah. And the still, small voice spoke to him again by asking him a question. What are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah recognized the voice, and he took his cloak and he covered his face. What does this say to us about Elijah's understanding of God as compared to the understanding of the people who worship Baal? God is not in the natural disasters that come upon us. God is not in the tsunami, even though we call it an act of God. God is not in the earthquake. God is not in the firestorm. God is not in these things that wreak havoc upon our lives and even destroy human life. But rather, God, the true God, is to be found in the still small voice that speaks within the depths of the human heart. St. Paul the Apostle in the second reading identifies this as the voice of conscience. Christ speaks to us through the Holy Spirit within the depths of our hearts. That is the difference between the worship of Yahweh and the worship of Baal. Baal is a false god. Yahweh is the true God, a God of mercy, a God of compassion, who seeks to save the lostness of humanity, who seeks to invite human beings into a cooperative covenant in which we work for the redemption and the peace of the whole world. And our weapons are not weapons of violence. It is the weapon of love. It is the weapon of faith. And it's the weapon of joy. It is these things that we are armed with. And we follow the Lord Jesus in his way of redemption, of salvation, because it is the way of love. Violence is like natural catastrophe. It is not of God. It never was, and it never will be. There is no place for hatred within the human heart. And the only way we can dislodge hatred is if we let go of our fears, because all hatred, all anger emerges from a state of fear which has taken hold and has held in captivity the human heart. I've said to you before, the opposite of love is not hatred. That's merely the distortion of love. The opposite of love is fear. And the continual message of Jesus Christ to his disciples, the one command he gave most frequently to his followers, and he speaks it to us today: do not be afraid. And in today's gospel, Jesus now dismisses the multitudes who had gathered around, and they were fed by the miraculous multiplication of the loaves and fishes. That was the gospel of last week. The day was getting late and Jesus sends the people home. He even tells his disciples to get into the boat and go back across the lake to a place of great danger and risk. Go there. Be not afraid. And Jesus himself goes up to a solitary place because at this moment, because he was grieving the loss of his friend John the Baptist, he wanted to be alone in solitude that he may seek his God and Father in prayer. Then it came to be quite late, about 3 o'clock in the morning, and the disciples in the darkness of the night were only halfway across the Sea of Galilee in their boat, a 9-hour voyage, a 9-mile voyage, when suddenly a storm comes out of nowhere upon the lake. And the disciples began to be battered with winds and waves, and their little boat just seemed like it was falling apart in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And they were afraid. Now these were people who grew up on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. They were experienced fishermen. They'd been out on that lake hundreds of times in their lifespan. And if they were afraid, this was a serious problem. They thought they were going to die. And it even gets worse. As they are there in the darkness, amidst the storm and the winds and the great waves, they look out and they behold a figure approaching them, walking on the water. And they think it's a ghost. Now, why would that terrify them? Well, ghosts are kind of an uncanny experience. I think it would frighten anyone. But it was believed in the ancient world, maybe even today by many, when you start seeing ghosts, that means your time has come. Death is imminent. You're now seeing ghosts. It's all over. So as far as they were concerned, the figure coming across the water was the Grim Reaper. And it was all over. And they were afraid. And then the figure on the water calls out to them and says, and the first words from his mouth is, "Be not afraid." Do not be afraid. He is not only speaking to those disciples who were in an impossible situation that threatened their own doom, but these are words that echo down through the centuries and speak to you, my brother, and speaks to you, my sister. The word of the risen Christ is always the same. Be not afraid. That's in the imperative. It's not a suggestion. It's a command. We are not to be afraid. For when our hearts are gripped by fear, we are led to do all kinds of inhumane actions because fear gives birth to hatred. This is what we're witnessing now in the Middle East. This is why we are called to pray for our Assyrian Christian brothers and sisters in the midst of this tumult. Be not afraid. Then there's Peter. Peter shows up in these narratives, and it's a literary device. Not that it's not historically accurate, but it's a literary device because when Peter shows up in the story, he's you. He's me. It's a literary device. He's every man, every woman. He is us. And so Peter calls out to Jesus on the waves, who's walking on the surface of the water, "If it's really you, Lord, invite me to come out to walk on the waves." And so he does. This is an interesting story, isn't it? And so Peter gets out of the boat. How heroic of Peter. What faith Peter has. And he begins to take the first steps and he's walking on the water. And all of a sudden, he looks around and he sees the wind. And he sees the waves. And he becomes afraid. And so, the writer says, he begins to sink. Now, I don't know about you, when I tried walking on water, I think we've all done this, at a local swimming pool when I was young, I didn't begin to sink. I just took one step and I was under the water. So here Peter is gradually sinking. He's losing his faith. But then it causes him to do something. It causes him to do something. He prays a prayer. I would in that circumstance as well. Lord, save me. Whenever we are being overcome by the storms that hit our lives, we can resort to that same prayer. Jesus, save me. Save me. And what does Jesus do? He immediately stretches out his hand, grasps hold of Peter, and lifts him up, and they go back into the boat. And then Jesus says to Peter, "Oh, you of little faith, why were you afraid?" And the disciples worshipped him. They worshipped him, a human being. Because at that moment they realized that he was more than human, that he was divine, that surely he must be the Son of God. My brothers and sisters, when you are beset by troubles that are so great that there is no words to describe the sense of grief or pain that you are experiencing, there is one who you can call out to. One who is willing to lend his hand. There is the still small voice within your heart, which is the voice of Jesus, who doesn't necessarily remove the storms of our lives, but guarantees that we will survive, that we will go through the storm and we will never be alone. He is ever at our side, and that he will bring us to that place of eventual peace and calm. As in the gospel story, the waters and the winds began to return to peace. This is what faith is. So do not be afraid, my brothers and sisters, but call out to the one who has the power to save, and you will encounter the living presence of the risen Christ. And that, my brothers and sisters, is the gospel of the Lord.
Amen.
Let us stand together as we profess our faith.